So I was asked to come here and tell you about life after GWC, the highs and lows of my career and how I got to where I am now. In a nutshell, I wanted to tell you about my journey from failing to get into vet school to becoming a CEO of my own company, Caritas Bioscience, and my journey from being one of the quietest people to ever grace the corridors of the school to standing up speaking publicly at events like this. And I hope that perhaps I can convey the message that although things don't necessarily always go the way we planned or hoped, that's not necessarily a bad thing. And in fact, sometimes when one proverbial door closes, we might see a better one standing wide open right beside us. And also that each of us are capable of overcoming our greatest fears and challenges if we put our mind to it. When I was preparing to come here today, I got to thinking about what I remembered from school, and in particular, who I could remember coming to speak to us. And there was this one man in particular, I have no idea now who he was or what he was talking to us about, but I just remember one story he told. He said he'd been traveling on a train one day and sitting opposite a young man who had this crazy hair, like a mohawk hairdo with all different colors. So he was staring at this young man for quite a long time, staring and staring, until eventually the guy asked him what he was looking at. And so he looked at him and said, "No, it's just that I had an affair with a parrot once, and I'm afraid you might be the offspring." I have no idea what the message of that speech was. That's all I remember. So I'm not sure what you'll take away from today, but hopefully something other than fornicating foul. But there was actually one theme that was really prominent for me in my school memories and has actually continued to play a prominent part throughout my life, and that is mountains. Hill walking, trekking, and mountains. At school, that was in the form of Duke of Edinburgh's award, projects, and I was super lucky to trek in the Himalayas. Turns out there's a bright side to spending 3 weeks with your teachers. That was my first introduction to silver linings. And in my adult life, it's been a ski season after uni and now living at the foot of the Pentland Hills, just up the road, so I can explore them every day with my dog. I have fond memories of D of E, as I'm sure many of you will have too, although I'm not sure I could ever face having dehydrated mashed potatoes again. When I received my gold award, I was lucky to meet the former Duke of Edinburgh, Queen Elizabeth's husband, the late Prince Philip, at Holyrood Palace. When he got round to our group, he asked if any of us had been anywhere exotic for our expeditions. And I just remember that one girl piped up, "We went to England." And he looked at us quizzically and said, "Really?" And then he asked, "And were the natives friendly?" And we decided not to answer that question. So, congrats to those of you who've completed yours and heading off to meet Prince Edward this summer. Memory to cherish. Anyway, I figured that building a business is kind of like climbing a mountain. Building a career and a life is like trekking through unknown territory. Sometimes the path isn't entirely clear. It can be bumpy, has its ups and downs. Sometimes the terrain is a little rough, but the views and experience you have along the way can be spectacular, and they make you who you are. So, what was my journey? Well, like I said, when I was at school, I wanted to be a vet. From as young as I can remember, that's all I wanted to do. And I worked hard, I studied all the sciences, spent all my weekends doing work experience. But when it came to my final exams, I simply didn't get the grades. I didn't get into vet school, and that dream was over. So, heading off to uni, I was a bit lost, really. I had absolutely no idea what I was going to do with my life, and somehow randomly ended up with a degree in physiology, sports science, and nutrition. From there, I applied for anything and everything to do with science because that's all I knew, and I got a job in the clinical research industry managing clinical trials. If you're not familiar, a clinical trial is when we test new medicines in humans to check that they are safe and effective. You might have heard about clinical trials during COVID when they had these huge, great studies to test the new vaccines. That's the world that I work in, though personally, I haven't had anything to do with vaccines and COVID. My work has been mostly in cancer research, and more recently, I became interested in the brain. I've been really fortunate to work with some super interesting drugs. I've tested cannabis for epilepsy and psychedelics for depression. And when I say I have tested cannabis, I don't mean I broke out a spliff and let people know how I was feeling. I mean, these are proper scientific studies in real hospital environments with highly specialist teams of doctors and nurses and all the rest. I'm talking about proper medicinal uses of these drugs and not recreational. I believe these drugs have very significant potential as medicines, but that they absolutely should be tested for safety and efficacy in the same way as any other medicine. So, my line of work exists to check that everybody is doing what they are meant to be doing. My colleagues and I are there to check that patients are being kept safe and that everyone is following the law. We're also there to help things run smoothly and to help solve problems when they pop up. Because the world of human medicine and clinical trials can be a crazy one at times. Human patients are unpredictable, and you never quite know what might happen next. The most extreme examples I've come across are things like heroin addicts blowing themselves up with fireworks or using their central line to inject drugs. Well, that is the tube that was put in to give them their chemotherapy. But more commonly, it's things like trying to figure out what to do when a patient's taken the dog's medicine by mistake. Thankfully, to my knowledge, no one has grown a tail yet. But in a situation like that, our medics have to rush around and figure out if there's likely to be any side effects and what to do about it. And you'd be surprised how often that happens. Normally, it turns out fine and would be worse if it was the other way around and they accidentally gave the dog their human medicine. It would be terrible if you accidentally gave your beloved pet highly toxic chemotherapy drugs, and nobody needs to see a labradoodle on magic mushrooms. So I worked for a number of different companies over the years. This is just some of them on the slide. Once I was in the industry, I found it quite easy to move around, and that's how I moved myself up the ladder by moving around big companies, small companies. I worked in the NHS at one point. I remember one of my lecturers at university saying that because we're scientists or studying to be scientists at the time, we would have to make a choice between choosing a career that would make good money or a career that we would enjoy. In other words, the choices seemed to be at that time that you went and got a well-paid graduate scheme job in a bank or you worked as an academic scientist. It was a no-brainer for me. I was always going to choose to do a job that would give me fulfillment. And I have concluded since that in fact, if you become an expert in your chosen field, if you're fascinated enough at the subject, then actually salary takes care of itself. And I've always chosen jobs on that basis. I've always moved to a new role for the experience it would give me as opposed to the salary offering. And because of that, I managed to gain quite a lot of experience quite quickly, which ultimately made me more employable and successful in getting promoted up the ladder. So, personally, I would recommend following your heart when it comes to job choices. I think when you follow your heart, it really comes across in interviews too. There's a couple of interviews that really stick out in my mind. There was one where I got asked the dreaded question, what has been your biggest achievement and your biggest failure in life? And that's an awful question, a horrible interview question. I remember I couldn't really think of anything clever to say, so I thought, well, I'm just going to have to be really honest. So I told them, well, the biggest failure of my life. I thought I would start with the failure, so I ended on a positive note. The biggest failure of my life was not getting into vet school. I was devastated because I'd worked so hard for it and that had been my dream my whole life. But that I believe everything happens for a reason and that helping people and curing cancer was the path that was meant for me. And my biggest achievement had been getting to the top of a Himalayan mountain when I was on a school trip. I told them that was the toughest thing I ever done, and that I knew that if I got to the top of that mountain, then I could achieve anything I set my mind to, and that it's something I've always remembered and gives me confidence. And the interviewer's response was that that was the best answer to that question he had ever heard. I had bared my soul, and I think that came across. I think I realized the power of integrity and honesty in that moment, and that's something that is integral to my business to this day. So don't underestimate those experiences you've gained at school. It was challenging that Himalayan climb, but hey, the view from the top of the highest mountain in the Ladakh region of India's Kashmir. Well, I can't tell you, it was a whiteout when we got to the top. That's us on the summit. Couldn't see a thing. Anyway, speaking of interviews, there was actually another interview that sticks in my mind again for a similar reason. I was very early in my career, and I remember they asked me, what do you know about electronic data capture systems? And now these were in the days when we all worked with paper, if you can believe that. Doing things digitally was new to us, and I was new to the industry as a whole. And I was horrified. I'd never heard of this concept, and I felt a bit embarrassed, but I couldn't think of anything to say. So again, I thought, well, I'll just have to be honest. So I said, I'm sorry, I don't know anything about that. And the interviews paused, and then they said, well, neither do we, and they burst out laughing. I was honest, we had a rapport, and I got the job. So always be authentically you. Sometimes building a business and a career feels a bit like a mountain trek. It feels a bit like climbing Ben Nevis. Have you ever done that? I did that the summer after I left school, actually. So I was your age. Ben Nevis is a long walk. It's long. It's winding. It's false summit after false summit. And it feels a bit like running the March Hare or the April Bunny. But I tell you what, speaking of views, when you get to the summit, the view from the summit of the highest mountain in the UK, well, again, I couldn't tell you because it was a whiteout when we got to the top, but I'm sure it's lovely. Rapport in interviews is important. Rapport in the workplace is important. I worked for a variety of different companies, as I said, some where it felt like one big happy family, and some where the culture was toxic and everyone was competing against each other. I've worked for some of the best leaders in the industry and what I consider to be some of the worst. I've had supportive managers, I had managers that hired and fired on a whim, and I learned from all of them, the good and the bad. I learned what to do and what not to do, what kind of leader I did and did not want to be, and that's ultimately what led me to start my own company. It kind of came out of the blue, to be honest. That was never on my agenda to be a business owner. The idea of owning a business never crossed my mind for a second when I was at school or even in the early days of my career. But after a series of certain events, it just suddenly hit me that I wanted to create an organization that would treat its staff well, a company that would be centered around my values of integrity and kindness. And the name of the company had to encompass that. Caritas, a word you're all very familiar with. Caritas meaning love for all. And to me, that means caring for all of our people, whether it's our employees, our clients, and of course, most importantly, our patients. We've been through a few variations of the name now, Caritas Clinical, Caritas Neuro Solutions, and Caritas Bioscience, but those values have always been and will always be at the heart of it. So when I set up Caritas 7 years ago, the first project I worked on was one with cannabinoids. It was actually with an extract from the cannabis plant called CBD, which is not psychoactive, i.e., you can't get high from it. It's perfectly safe, and we established that it worked very well for these very rare types of children's epilepsy. And although my background was in cancer research, that epilepsy project really resonated with me because my brother and my uncle both had epilepsy when they were little. And then I realized that all the illnesses in my family had been neurological. So there had been Alzheimer's, depression, stroke, and trauma, and I'd been through a mental health journey of my own by that point. So I decided I wanted to see if I could build a clinical research organization that focused on anything to do with the mind or the brain. I'd got really fascinated with the workings of the mind, and I'd got really fascinated with the mind-body connection. So when I'm feeling depressed, there's one thing that really, really gives me a boost, and that is running. And that's a real physical reaction for me. I get a real high during and after going for a run. I don't remember feeling that during the march here. But it is a known real thing that your mental and physical health are connected. There's a really good book called Presence by Amy Cuddy, which does a kind of deep dive into the science of mind-body connection, though through the likes of yoga. And her particular thing is actually power poses and how if you do these stances, you can instantly lift your mood or feel more confident. So, likes of the Woman pose, where you have your hands on your hips, um, feet hip width apart, head stretching up to the sky, or there's the champion's pose, hands up in the air. Athletes do it purposely to psych themselves up. So, the most obvious one is Usain Bolt with his lightning bolt. I like to take it a step further and dance around a little, especially when I'm out with the dog. Where I live in Collington, I don't know if you know the area, not far from here, just a mile or two up the road, right on the edge of the Pentland Hills. I live pretty much right next to Dreghorn Army Barracks. So the whole part of the Pentlands is on military land and it's great. It's like where I go to escape and get away from the world. Take the dog up into the hills and just dance around in the fields with Disney tunes playing on my headphones. Very therapeutic, especially after a stressful day. So I was doing that recently, dancing around in the field and singing, and turned around to see a whole row of soldiers watching me. And you know that way where you try and pretend like you knew they were there. So yeah, that's happened a few times. Super embarrassing. But importantly, it's made me realize that the army's camouflage gear is really effective. I'm so embarrassed. I don't know about you, but when I get embarrassed, my face goes absolutely beetroot. I mean, so red that my dog thinks the postman has arrived. And guess what that is? It's an example of the mind-body connection. That's a real physiological response to an emotion and a thought. The blood vessels in my face dilate because of a thought. And I find that fascinating. Um, You can see it in other ways too. For example, I get eczema on my hands when I'm stressed. If you look at before and after pictures of Barack Obama through his presidency, his hair went white, again, caused by stress. So, if those are the sorts of physical effects that we can see, imagine what's going on inside our body. Well, we already know when we're in a state of stress, we're in fight or flight. So the stress hormones, cortisol and adrenaline, are pumping around and can, of course, damage our cardiovascular systems, among other things, under prolonged exposure. The fight or flight response is, of course, a good in short bursts, like if you're a caveman running away from a tiger. Um, but in our modern world, it's less useful, or in a work or school setting, it's particularly detrimental as it's purpose designed to shut down your ability to think. So in fight or flight, the limbic part of the brain, the oldest, most primal part of the brain, takes over and actively and purposely shuts down the outer cortex, which is where we do our rational thinking. It does this on purpose because obviously, if we're running away from a tiger, we don't have time to stop and think. But it's not useful if the teacher puts you on the spot and asks you a question or in the middle of an exam. That's what stage fright is. But apart from simply trying to overcome the fight or flight response, I got really fascinated by the effect your mental health can have on your physical health. And I realized that actually the root cause of many physical illnesses we see in our health service, the root causes often come from mental stresses. The brain and the body are so undeniably integrated. After all, the brain is in charge of every other part of our body. So if we're not looking after our brains, our bodies will suffer, and vice versa. So that's why I really wanted to build a business that focused on the mind and the brain. It's so central to our overall health. When I was sitting where you are, when I was in sixth year, the man of the moment was fellow former Watsonian and Olympic gold medalist Sir Chris Hoy. I find Chris incredibly inspiring, and I was listening to him speak on a podcast recently. One of the things he said was that when he started out in cycling, this would have been in the 90s, if you went to see the psychologist, people would ask what was wrong with you and call you loony and all sorts. Nowadays, if you're in elite sport and you're not seeing the team psychologist, people would be asking serious questions about why not, as you cannot possibly perform at the top of your game if you're not working on your mindset. And that applies to all sports. That applies to all areas of life and especially to business. So I want my team to perform at their best. I want them to get the most out of their careers, but also to feel completely fulfilled and happy in their personal lives. I'm very much of the Richard Branson school of thought that if you look after your employees, the employees will look after the business. So, how do you get people to perform at their best? Well, if you think about athletes like Chris Hoy, or just think about what you would need to do to achieve a physical feat, such as what need to do to climb to the top of a mountain, well, you need to exercise to keep physically fit. You need to eat the right things, you need to rest and sleep, and you need a mindset to keep going through the challenges. And having done an undergrad in sports science and nutrition, I had a good understanding of most of the exercise and nutrition needs of a human. But the one piece missing from my degree was mindset. So I decided to go back to uni. Now, most people at my level in their careers might consider studying an MBA or a master's in business administration, but I didn't really like the idea of studying a business degree, so I embarked on a master's in performance psychology, i.e., another sports science-based degree, but this time taking theories from elite sports performance and applying it to business. It's part time and it's outside of work, so it could take me up to 6 years, but that's something I'm working on at the moment. Already seeing the benefits of building a company culture that focuses on the whole health of employees. So even at my age, I'm still learning, still growing, still setting new goals and ambitions. When I got to the top of Ben Nevis or the top of the Himalayas, there was no view. But do I feel like either of those trips were a waste of time? Absolutely not. The Himalayan trip was one of the best experiences of my life, and the fact there was no view at the top doesn't make it any less of an achievement. It's kind of the same in my career. Some would say I've got to the top in inverted commas. I'm CEO of my business, but I'm not sitting there admiring the view. I don't think it's about the view, it's about the journey. You've got to enjoy the journey. And there's twists and turns along the path and unexpected weather, and you don't always know where you're going, but that doesn't make it any less enjoyable. I think it adds to the excitement. It's like an adventure, really. I've been lucky to have worked in all sorts of different companies, big and small. I've traveled all around the UK and sometimes abroad. I've made friends. I worked with some of the best people and the worst. I worked for a company where senior management were kind and fair and encouraging. And then I worked for a company where a senior team hired and fired on a whim and the culture was toxic. But I learned from all of it. Having been super quiet and shy at school, I learned how to talk to people. I learned what to do and what not to do, how to network, how to build connections, and to always mute your line on Zoom calls. There's a proverb that I have always loved, and it goes, nobody trips over mountains. It is the small pebble that causes you to stumble. Cross all the pebbles in your path, and you will find you have crossed the mountain. And I think that's the key. Just take one step at a time and enjoy the journey. So, to finish off, just bringing you up to date on New Year. This year, I decided I was going to start the year off really fresh, and I thought I'll get up super early to climb up the hill behind my house. That's Allermuir in the Pentlands. I'm going to get up super early and climb up Allermuir to watch the sunrise on New Year. So I did. I didn't have anything to drink on Hogmanay, and I went home to bed early and got up at, I think, around 6 a.m. or something silly on the 1st of January. And I hiked up Allermuir with my head torch to catch the sunrise. And can you guess what the view was like when I got to the top? Absolutely worth every minute. Thanks very much for listening. It's lovely to meet you all, and I'm happy to stick around if you have questions.